Hey, Nathan here. Welcome to another Unity2D tutorial. And in this tutorial, we are going to cover prefabs. Last tutorial, we discussed the menu system and how to add UI elements to our game and how to call scripts from a button. And we talked about a few little things with the basic goal of creating a basic menu system. In this video, we are going to discuss prefabs. So, prefabs are a great way to create copies of objects where you want to have the flexibility to edit one object and edit the rest of them. So the basic rule is if you're going to copy an object, make it a prefab. Chances are in some small games you might not need the benefits of prefab, but getting in that habit, you'll be lucky that you have taken that initiative and have done that originally. So later on down the road in your development, you don't regret your decision to have 20 copies of an object and they're not a prefab. If there's only one object, like if I drag this player paper in there, now I just have one spaceship. If there's only one object in the game of that specific type, there's no need to make a prefab. If there will eventually be copies, make it a prefab. I don't like how some people recommend making prefabs for everything. My basic rule is if you're going to make copies, make it a prefab. If you're not going to make copies, don't make it a prefab. Okay, so a prefab will let you manipulate one object and have it apply to all copies of that object. Whereas direct copies of this object, this isn't a prefab yet, direct copies of the object, I'd have to go in and modify each object directly. For example, this is my movement tutorial. I just created a new project, put in my player paper PNG file, put in my movement script, and you just saw me drag that player paper into the hierarchy. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this object to spaceship. So now it's a spaceship. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate this a few times. Now I'm going to hit Control D 3 times to duplicate these. So I made 3 direct copies of this spaceship. Now I'm going to go to the scene view and I'm going to make sure I have the second tool selected so I can move the objects around. And I'm going to move them around to, it doesn't matter, just a random position. Let's move that to the right a little bit, and this one I want to move down into the, let's move it to the left a little bit. Right there is good. I'm going to go back to the game view. Okay, so now these are direct copies of this sprite. It is not a prefab. So, if I want to make changes to all these sprites, I have to make changes to each one of these copies instead of changing it once. So, let's say if I want to have all 4 of these be able to be moved by my keyboard. So, if I hit play, and if I'm playing the game and I hit my arrow keys, nothing's happening. Okay. So when I select the original spaceship, go to Add Component, Movement, and then I hit play, the one in the middle should now respond to my keyboard input. But I want the other 3 to respond as well. So then I have to go into each one of the copies and add the movement script. Add the movement script and add the movement script on the last copy. Now I hit play and they are all moving to my keyboard input. Okay. I'm going to delete the copies. I'm going to leave the original and I'm going to delete the movement script component. So now we're back to where we were. Okay, so now we want to create a prefab of this. So if we make changes to one, we can apply it to all the others. In order to make a prefab, you have your object in the hierarchy here. You drag that down to your assets. And then it makes a prefab. Now if you select the object in the assets section, you will see it has a .prefab name. So you know it's a prefab. And the text is a little bit of a different color here as well. Okay, so let's do the same thing. Let's make duplicates of this prefab now. I'm going to hit Control D 3 times, so I have 4 objects, 3 copies. So now I'm going to go to my scene view, and I'm going to move these around just like we did last time. Move that up a little bit, and move this one to the left. Move that up a little bit too. Alright, now I'm going to go back to the game view. Just like last time, if I hit play now, nothing works. However, if I add a component here, and go to my movement component, movement script, and then I hit play, just one is now moving, but I want the others to move too. So we have this new line here, prefab, select, revert, or apply. So if I hit apply, all the changes I just made to this one prefab changed all the other ones. So now all the other ones have the script now. So if I hit play, now they are all responding to my keyboard input. Much better way of handling copies of objects. Now you might not necessarily have scripts attached to your copies. For example, if you're building a platformer game, you want to have a box collider on the ground so that your object will it responds to gravity, but when it hits the ground, it stops. So you need to have a collider on the ground object, which is the tile or whatever. You'll make a prefab because that will probably extend all the way across the bottom of the screen. You're not going to have one giant tile for the bottom of the screen. You might have 16 of those stacked directly next to each other. But you want all 16 of those to have a box collider so that it stops your player from going through the ground. That is why we need prefabs. Because if you add box collider to one and hit apply, it'll apply to all 16 of those that you have in the game. Now, that might not necessarily be something that you'll add either. But perhaps you have multiple copies and you decide later that I don't really like that color. Let's make it a black color. So if I go up here to the color here, and I select black. So it just changes the middle one. Then I hit apply. Now all of them have that same color. However, as you see here, position and rotation, in this example, these two are unique to that specific prefab. They are bold. It is unique. I don't want to have 20 prefabs stacked on top of each other and 20 prefabs rotated the same way. I might want this one to be rotated to 45 degrees and this one to be rotated 120 degrees. I don't want them all rotated the same way, and I don't want them all stacked on top of each other. It doesn't make any sense when you have 20 objects that they're all stacked on top of each other. So some of the properties here, if I could hit apply, it doesn't apply to the rest of them. So some of the properties here do not affect every single instance of the prefab. But things like color, attaching scripts, and that sort of thing does affect the prefabs. So if I hit play now, I can still move all these with keyboard input. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Next tutorial, we are going to discuss spawning objects with events. Basically, spawning objects with a button press. We're going to consider that an event. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you learned something about prefabs. It's a very good thing to do and get in the habit of. Follow the basic rule. If you're making copies of an object, make it a prefab. If it's going to be a single object, like a single spaceship, no need to make a prefab. It's only going to have one object in the game. Leave it alone as it is. But if you have multiple objects that you're creating copies of, make it a prefab. Chances are, in some cases, you might not need the benefits, but if you get in that habit, you'll appreciate that you took the initiative to make them a prefab before you had 20 objects set up in your game and find out, I really don't want to edit these 20 times, and then you have to delete all 20 of those and make them a prefab or relink them in some way. It just makes things a lot easier if you do that up front. So, single object, single instance of the object, leave it alone. If you're going to make multiple copies, just take the initiative and make it a prefab from the get-go. You might not need the benefits, but it'll help you out in the long run. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.